There were things about money you understood before anyone said them out loud. You knew which bills got paid first, not because someone explained priority, but because you saw your mother's hand hesitate over envelopes, sorting them into piles on the kitchen table. The electric bill always went to the left. The credit card offers went straight into the trash, unopened. Her face didn't change, but her shoulders did. You'd watch from the doorway, barefoot on cold tile, learning to read stress in the way fingers moved across paper. You learned to say, "We have food at home," before anyone even suggested stopping somewhere. You'd see the golden arches through the car window and already know the answer. The sentence lived in your mouth, ready, like you'd swallowed it years ago and it just kept coming back up. Sometimes you'd say it just to save everyone the trouble. Sometimes you'd feel proud for remembering, like you were helping. There was a specific way you held money when you were sent to the store, folded twice, tucked inside your palm, thumb pressed over it. You didn't let it show. You didn't let it sit loose in your pocket where it could fall out, or where anyone walking past could see the outline. You counted it 3 times before you left the house and twice on the way there, feeling the edges soften from your sweat. You knew the price of milk without checking. And bread. And eggs. You knew because you'd heard the numbers enough times, standing in the aisle while someone did math in their head, lips moving slightly, putting one thing back to afford another. You started doing it too. Adding in your head while you walked, making sure the total stayed under the number you'd been given, building in a buffer just in case. You learned to leave the room when adults started talking about money, not because you were told to, because their voices changed, because the air got thinner. Because you understood, somewhere deep, that your presence made it harder for them to say what needed to be said. You'd go to your room and turn on music or TV, something loud enough that you couldn't hear the exact words, but quiet enough that you'd know when it was over. You didn't need it explained. There was a drawer in the kitchen that sometimes had cash in it and sometimes didn't. You never asked about it. You just knew that when it was empty, certain things weren't possible. No asking. No reminding. You learned to read the drawer without opening it, just by the way someone moved near it. By whether they went toward it with purpose or avoided it entirely, choosing a different path through the kitchen. You got good at mental math. Not from school. From sitting in the cart while someone added prices as they went, or standing beside them while they counted coins on the counter, separating quarters from dimes, making sure they had enough before the cashier finished scanning. Your brain learned to hold numbers, stack them, round up to be safe. It became automatic, this counting. You did it even when it wasn't your money. You knew which friends' houses felt different the moment you walked in. Something about the air, the way things were arranged, the fact that the pantry door stayed open and nobody seemed to count anything. You didn't talk about it. You just noticed. And you made yourself smaller without thinking. Ate less at their dinner table. Didn't ask for seconds even when offered. Said you weren't that hungry. There was a version of maybe later that meant no. And a version of we'll see that meant no. And a version of not right now that also meant no. You learned to hear all of them the same way. You learned to stop asking before the answers started to hurt. You learned to want things quietly, privately, in a space where disappointment couldn't reach anyone but you. You remember the first time you realized other kids didn't know what things cost. They just asked and received. Or they asked and got told no for reasons that had nothing to do with money because it was too late, or too much sugar, or just because. Not because the number was impossible. You watched them ask for things casually, without the calculation, without the preparation. It looked like a different language. At the time, it felt normal. You learned to make yourself less expensive. Smaller portions without being told, wearing shoes a little longer, saying you didn't want something before anyone had to say they couldn't afford it. You carried that math everywhere. It lived under your skin. You became an expert at not needing things, at talking yourself out of wants before they became requests, before they became problems someone else had to solve. There was a way your parents' voice sounded on the phone when they were talking about bills. Flatter, quieter. You could hear it from the next room, through the wall, even when you couldn't hear the words. You'd stay still until the call ended. Sometimes you'd hold your breath without meaning to, like if you were silent enough, the conversation would go better, like your stillness could somehow help. You knew how to answer when someone asked what you wanted for your birthday. Not the real answer, the small answer. The one that wouldn't make anyone's face do that thing where they smiled but their eyes didn't move. You practiced it sometimes. Made lists in your head of acceptable requests. Things that wouldn't cost too much or require too much explanation. Things that wouldn't make anyone feel bad. You learned that some silences were about money even when no one said the word. You'd be sitting at the table and someone would sigh, long and slow, staring at something you couldn't see. And you'd know. You'd just know. The quality of the quiet was different, heavier. You'd finish eating faster, clear your plate without being asked, trying to make the moment pass more quickly. You became aware of how long things lasted, how many days the leftovers stretched, how many times you could wear something before it had to be washed, how much toothpaste was left in a tube that looked empty but wasn't. You developed a sense for it, like knowing when the sun's about to set. You learned to make things last longer than they were supposed to stretch and extend and preserve. You already knew what came next. There was a feeling that came with thrift stores. Not bad, just specific. The smell of other people's fabric. The way you looked at price tags differently with relief instead of curiosity. You learned not to mention where things came from. You learned which tags to cut out, which brands to avoid mentioning because people would know they didn't sell them new anymore, not for years. You got used to hearing "not today" when you were standing in a checkout line and someone realized they'd miscalculated. Watching them choose what to put back, the cereal, the juice. The thing you'd been holding that suddenly went back on the shelf, your hand still warm from carrying it. You learned not to react, not to look disappointed, to hand it over smoothly, like you'd changed your mind, like it was your choice. You learned that money was both invisible and everywhere, that it decided things without being mentioned, that it lived in the space between what was said and what was possible, that you could feel its presence even in rooms where no one was talking. It was in the pause before someone answered a question, in the way plans changed without explanation, in the things that never got suggested in the first place. You started noticing when other people didn't notice, when they bought something without checking the price first, when they ordered without looking at the right side of the menu, when they replaced things that still worked just because they wanted to. It wasn't judgment, it was just surprising. Every time, like watching someone speak a language fluently that you'd only ever studied from a distance. You knew the difference between broken and we can still use it, between empty and there's a little left if you scrape the sides, between needing new clothes and these still fit if you don't. Think about it too hard. These weren't just phrases, they were philosophies, entire systems of living that you absorbed without anyone teaching them directly. You learned to be grateful loudly and specifically. Not just "thank you," but "thank you so much, this is perfect. I really love it." Even when it wasn't quite what you wanted, because you understood what it cost, not the price. The other cost, the one that didn't print on receipts. The sacrifice embedded in every purchase, every gift, every small gesture that required money to leave one place and go to another. This wasn't the last time. You remember realizing that some people saved for things they wanted, and other people saved to make sure nothing fell apart. That savings meant something different depending on which side of that line you were on. You couldn't say when you learned this. You just woke up one day and already knew. The word had two completely different definitions, living in the same language, and which one applied to you wasn't something you got to choose. There was a specific kind of tired that came from worrying about money. You recognized it in your parents' face even before you had language for it. It looked different than other kinds of tired. It sat different. It didn't leave after sleep. You'd see it in the morning before coffee, in the afternoon during quiet moments, late at night when they thought everyone was asleep. It was always there, just beneath the surface, like a second face wearing the first one. You learned that "afford" was a full sentence, that it didn't need explanation or apology attached, that sometimes the answer was just that word, hanging in the air, meaning everything and nothing, and you both understood. No one elaborated. No one needed to. The word carried its own weight, its own complete meaning, and adding anything else would only make it heavier. You developed a radar for when something cost more than expected. You'd see it in the way someone touched a price tag, the pause before they said, "okay," the slight change in breathing. You learned to sense financial stress in others before they showed it, before they said anything. It was survival. If you could feel it coming, you could prepare. You could make yourself smaller, need less, want quieter. There were things you never brought home from school, permission slips for trips that cost money, fundraiser packets, order forms for pictures or yearbooks. You'd fold them small, Shove them deep in your bag, throw them away before anyone could see, not because you were told to, because you already knew. The math was simple. You did it automatically now, filtering requests before they became questions. You learned this early. You remember the weight of coins in your pocket, saved from lunch money, from change you didn't spend. How you'd count them at night, stacking them in small towers on your bed, trying to make them add up to something significant, something that could matter. Something that could solve one small problem, even if you didn't know which one yet. You knew which conversations to have and which to avoid. You didn't ask about vacations other kids took. You didn't ask why you weren't going. You didn't ask about new things you saw in other houses, newer cars, different clothes. You learned that curiosity had a cost too, and sometimes the price was making someone feel something they'd been trying not to feel. There was a version of pride that came with making do, with fixing instead of replacing, with finding another way. You'd hear it in someone's voice when they figured out how to stretch something further, when they solved a problem without spending money. That small victory, that quiet win. You learned to celebrate those moments even when no one else understood why they mattered. You learned that money wasn't just about having or not having. It was about the space in between, the constant calculation, the daily negotiation with yourself about what was necessary and what wasn't. The voice in your head that ran numbers without being asked, that weighed every choice against every other choice, that never really stopped, even when you were trying to think about something else. If you stayed this long, you already know how this feels. It doesn't end. It just keeps teaching you things nobody planned to say. And you keep learning them, over and over, in every small moment where the math doesn't quite work out, where the answer is already no before the question gets asked, where you've already made yourself smaller before anyone noticed you were taking up space.